morning. Welcome to the garden. I'm glad you're all here with us again. You know, I was thinking about this. This service probably ought to have a warning attached to it. Something sacrilegious is about to happen. Warning, heretic present. So hang in there. You've seen the videos we started with. You kind of guess the path we're taking. Anyway, I'm glad you're here. The Bible passage this morning is where we're going to start. And this is a passage that is attributed to Jesus speaking, and it occurs only in Matthew's gospel. And it refers to that entity that we call the church. And one of the things you need to know is that it only shows up twice with Jesus calling something the church. And both of those are in Matthew's gospel. Let's look at it. You are, Peter, a rock. This is the rock on which I will put together my church, a church so expansive with energy that not even the gates of hell will be able to keep it out. Now, there's some things we need to remember and recall when it comes to looking at the Bible passage. This is out of Matthew's Gospel. You remember the Gospels are those first four books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Remember that they were written decades after the death of Jesus, so they're written in retrospect. Most scholars who've studied this passage intently do not believe that those are the words of Jesus, mainly because Jesus was a Jew. He was born a Jew, he died a Jew, and it was not his intention, they believe, to start a new religion. And yet that particular passage about Peter being the rock and upon you I will found my church is one that's often used to, I suppose, enhance power a little bit. If any of you have any Catholic background, you may have heard this used that way. And it's used to enhance the power of the church and the power of the Pope in particular. Those of us who are Protestants would disagree with that particular stance. And the word church, I suppose when many of us think of church, except if you've been at the garden very long, you probably think of a immense building with all of this fancy stuff in it and ornate and everything like that. But what he's talking about here, the word church, is really about a gathering of people. A church is always the people. And in this particular instance, it's the writers who wrote this, again, several decades after Jesus, were talking about those early years of the faith. This is a period that Harvey Cox, in his book, The Future of Faith, refers to as the age of faith. And it was probably the purest form of faith we had. These are the folks who, in one way or another, knew Jesus or his disciples and were part of what was called the way. They wanted to be followers of the way and try to live their lives more the way Jesus lived because they saw him as a revelation of who God is and what God is like. That lasted for 100 or so years, and then things started to change a little bit because initially the church was there to really provide guidelines and to encourage people to live more the way Jesus lived. But then, there were lots and lots and lots of beliefs out there, all kinds of different perspectives and understandings of who God was and what God was like and who Jesus was and what Jesus was like, and there was just a ton of stuff. So the church thought they needed to standardize things, to regulate things a little bit. So they weren't to work on doing that. And Harvey Cox says that that's what's called the age of belief, that's the age that began after Jesus and his disciples and basically continued till right now. We're moving out of it now into what he calls the age of the Spirit, at least supposedly. But that's the age that was there. And this is what Harvey Cox says. Church leaders began formulating orientation programs for new recruits who had not known Jesus or his disciples personally. Emphasis on belief began to grow when these primitive instruction kits thickened into catechisms, replacing faith in Jesus with tenets about Jesus. So it was no longer trying to just trust Jesus and live life accordingly. It began you have to believe a certain way. Now, I've mentioned to you before my revelation when I was studying about the councils. There were councils that took place in the 4th and 5th century. In 325 was the first one, the Council of Nicaea. Now, that was convened actually by Constantine, who was the emperor of Rome. It was very much a political kind of gathering. The second one that's mostly talked about is 451, and that was the Council of Chalcedon. But that Nicaea is the one where people, all these beliefs were there, and some people weren't allowed in, some people were banned, some beliefs were blackballed, and we came to this standardized version of what the faith was supposed to be. That's basically what's been passed down all these years. That's what we've inherited. And it's as though the eyes and ears of the church are slammed shut so that nothing new can get in, that no new revelations can come to be. In the words of Philip Newell, the church and Christianity have become fossilized. Now let's think about this word fossilized. It's an interesting one. In my mind, and this is sort of stream of consciousness thinking, but in my mind I thought rock. And when I think of a rock, I think of something hard, something you can hit somebody in the head with if you wanted to. Hopefully you don't. But I think about a rock, and I know not all rocks are like that, but in my mind it was hard. And then I moved over to fossilized, talking about a fossil. So I looked that up. Fossils are the remains or impressions of prehistoric organism in petrified form. I love that word petrified. This is how it's defined. Organic matter changed into strong substance to cause to lose vitality or become impervious to change, deaden. Voila! That's the church. Did you pick up on that? Organic, natural, kind of flows around that way. And then it lost vitality, became impervious to change, and got dead. That's the 2,000-year-old thing that we've inherited. And it doesn't always fit. Those worldviews don't always fit in today's world. Well, Philip Newell, in his book, The Rebirthing of God, gives a further explanation of what he means by this fossilization of Christianity. This is what he says. It, meaning Christianity, has become hardened, stuck both doctrinally and ritually. It is not living and unfolding like the universe, forever seeking new expression and embodiment through relationship. It has become isolated from the other great religious traditions of the world and ossified in its dogma, paralyzed in the trappings of infallibility. Amen. That's all I can say. That's a pretty heavy indictment, actually, if you stop to think about it. And I do agree with Newell on that. So do some other people. For instance, the Quaker pastor and author Phil Gully, who's been here and spoken to the garden. He wrote the book I intended to write after I retired, so I guess I'm going to have to find something else to do. But his book is entitled, or one of his books is entitled, If the Church Were Christian. And he begins by talking about going to a museum, and I kind of wonder if it's not the Children's Museum, and seeing the skeleton of a dinosaur, and how impressed he was with it, and how remarkable it was to see this giant creature who lived millions of years ago. And he read the plaque then that was right by this skeleton of the dinosaur, and he learned that not all those bones were authentic, that only a few of them were. And paleontologists had actually studied those and then created other bones to create this skeleton of the dinosaur. Gully said that's a lot what's happened in the church. And these are the words he wrote. In many ways, this is similar to what the church has done. There are only two passages in one gospel where Jesus, and that's Matthew, where Jesus mentions the church. And even those references are dubious. Many scholars, and that's a kind way of saying that, I think. Many scholars suspect the Matthean, meaning the Matthew verses, were not original to Jesus, but were written back into the text by persons hoping to bolster their theological and ecclesial positions by placing them in the mouth of Jesus. In other words, the sense was that they would have more power if they attributed this to Jesus. And that's the kind of thing we've inherited. That's become what we've dealt with all these years. And it's as though the church has closed the books on everything, saying everything that could be understood about God, everything that could be understood about life, everything that could be understood about the world is done. It's over and done with. Well, I don't think that's true, because I believe God is active in our world and continues to reveal God's self in our world. It's a matter of opening our eyes and seeing it. And I think the faith needs to adapt to that kind of thing. And if we were to do that, I think it would make a difference. You know, I believe if we really followed that path and began to question things a little bit more, that we would find a faith that is more loving, that is more gentle, more kind, one that actually leads us more toward transformation and changing our lives inside out. And I think that's the kind of thing Jesus wanted to happen. You know, I'm concerned that we as pastors have in some ways compromised the faith that Jesus tried to share. That the most important thing for him was the great commandment, to love God, to love one another, and to love oneself. And I think we have, in one way or another, tried to regiment those things and have defended the faith, saying it's absolutely true, and not been willing to admit our own doubts and questions. And in that way, I think we've just gone along and have compromised the faith. Well, if that's what's happened, what would our faith look like if it were really Christian? I think there's several things that would happen. Several different authors talk about this, and I've kind of pulled the things out that at least I think speak to me. One of the things I think that would be the case is that it would be less about doctrine or creed and a lot more about God's grace. Grace has to do with God's undeserved love for us. The fact that we can't do anything to earn it, that God loves us from beginning to end with a love that is absolutely overwhelming. And we have that love. We haven't had to do anything to earn it. That's what grace is. It's an incredible gift. I think that's a piece of what it would be like if the church and Christianity were really Christian. I think there's something else that would happen too. I think we would focus more on the goodness embedded within humans instead of the sinfulness of people. Because focusing on the goodness is what brings the good out of people. It's what helps us want to be better and want to do what we can to make life better, to change this world and to make a difference. I think if the church were really Christian, we would encourage folks to dig for themselves, to really try to understand, to search, and to try to find what feels true, what rings true in their hearts, because that really is what counts when it's all said and done. I think we would look at Jesus more as an example of how we should live our lives, rather than as an object that we would worship. And I think we'd have to let go of some outmoded things that just can't stand up to today's scientific discoveries. Stories like the creation, both stories of creation that we find in Genesis, the story of Noah's Ark. Those are myths. Those are stories. People were trying to understand what was going on in the world, and they were using other myths that existed to tell those stories. For people to go out and search for Noah's Ark is just ridiculous in my mind. And to say that the world, as we've seen in the video, was created literally in 6 days just doesn't work. We know that. We know that scientifically, and we need to honor those kinds of things in our lives. So that's something else I think that would change. And if the church were really Christian, I think we as pastors would not spend our passion and energy trying to defend the institution that's the church. It seems to me that our role as pastors is to try to open the doors if we can and try to let God's love flow as much as we can and let people experience that so that they can then begin on their own journey. I also think we probably need to honor a lot more the other religions of the world, the other faith traditions, because there are a lot of things we can learn from one another. And when we do that, we would discover that we were a lot more similar than we are different. Now, Philip Newell talks about this in that book I mentioned to you, The Rebirthing of God. And he talks particularly about Gandhi. I learned some things I didn't know about Gandhi. For instance, I learned that Gandhi was described as the 20th century most Christ-like figure. Interesting, isn't it? Because he was Hindu. He was not Christian at that point. And Gandhi said that if we really practiced what Jesus taught, it would make a difference in our world, that we would love one another and we would love even our enemy, that would make the world very different from the world it's in now. And Newell says this: Gandhi challenged us to turn our creed back into deed, our belief in Jesus into following the practice of Jesus. You see, it's not just something we talk about. It has to be something we live, something we practice, something we share, this love that we share with one another. And it can make an incredible difference if we live that way. Can you imagine how our lives would be different if we let God's love flow in us and through us and out from us? It would make us different. It would make our world a very different place. And you know, it might even crack open that frozen terrain of Christianity and allow God's love to soften it, to warm it, and let that light of God's love glow in this world. But you know what? It's up to us. We're the ones who have to carry that light. We're the ones who have to share that love. It doesn't do us any good to talk about it or to put it in our heads. It has to be in our hearts and our minds and our spirits. And it's up to us to share it in whatever way we can. So I guess the question is, are we ready to do that?